podcasts. There's a show I want you to consider for the People's Choice Podcast Awards. Writers and Illustrators of the Future podcast in 3 categories: education, storyteller and drama, and arts. News on the flip side. It's time for you to get out and nominate your favorite podcast. There's an amazing show I want you to consider for the People's Choice Podcast Awards. The News on the Flip Side in the category of politics and news.
This podcast is dedicated to the aspiring writer and artist and will provide inspiration and tips from top professionals in the field. If you've been listening to this podcast or are new to it, I thank you very much. I would also appreciate if you took a moment to follow it on whatever platform you use to listen to your podcasts. Writers of the Future is one of the longest running writing competitions in the world, now celebrating 4 decades of providing a helping hand as initially conceived by L. Ron Hubbard. I also want to let you know that the books are available, Writers of the Future, are available in bookstores throughout the US, Canada, the UK, South Africa, and Australia, as well as all throughout the major online retailers around the rest of the world. Now, I'm here today at the Writers and Illustrators of the Future workshop in Hollywood, where winners from year 40 are here to unhinge their jaws and open wide so that famous fire hose of information is shot down their throats. One of the highlights is when winners can meet an editor and discover what's actually needed from an editor's perspective when they write their stories to get published. I've got 2 such people today. I've got the publisher of Galaxy's Edge, Shahid Mamoud, and I've got the editor, Lezli Robyn. Welcome, Shahid and Lezli.
Thank you.
So I'm going to start with Lezli because I've known her longer. So we met, I think, you're Rob Sawyer's +1 at a Dragon Con dinner where I had all the judges. I think that's the first time I remember meeting you. And I then subsequently met you every year, and we became more and more, friends. And then I went through a whole cycle with Mike Resnick and that story of him taking you on. And then unfortunately when he passed and you took over his magazine. So I guess just a bit on how you came to become an editor, because you're also an author, but how you became to be an editor. And I also love the story of how you got brought into the fold.
Okay. So I have to make a quick note first that the dinners that John's talking about is he'll take the judges out at DragonCon. So whatever judge that's does for the Writers of the Future will be at DragonCon. And I just happen to know pretty much all the judges. So I would be like the +1 invite of several times, several years in a row.
Yes.
And so I really got to know John and Emily through that. And so I was almost foisted upon you and that's how you met me. But when it comes to my editing, originally, and it's partly my origin story, when I first I always joke that I bought my career off eBay or bought Mike Resnick off eBay, and it's because I met Reich on eBay and I brought an Anne McCaffrey book. I wanted a signed book of hers, and I made the mistake of saying, well, we can't, I haven't read any of your work. And he's like, well, we can't have that. So he sent me books.
This is Mike Resnick.
Yes, Mike Resnick. And what ended up happening is I'm like, well, I don't want him to think I just, pretended to read them or whatever. So I critiqued them, which is what you don't do, apparently. I found out later. And he didn't respond to the tweaks much, like my critiques, but he would send me more books. And I'm like, oh my God, this is becoming a full-time job. Now, what he pointed out is after a few months, he said, you're spotting stuff my editor doesn't spot, like even spot. Do you want to become a writer? So the first path was to become an author. I obviously said, no, I don't want you to think that I'm talking to you to get a writing career.
Right.
And so that's how the writing path started, though, because eventually Lee Modisett, another well-known author, convinced me that, no, Mike does this it's one of his joys is to help new writers start a career. You should take him up on it. But if you note from that first thing he said, you're spotting stuff my editors don't spot. And so while I started with a writing career, obviously with the help of Mike Resnick, I also had the ability to look at structure and work out the nuts and bolts of a story.
Right.
And so, of all things, it was another one of those coincidence things that Shahid here noticed me talking to actually Mike's writer babies, and I was introducing them to other authors because they were too shy. They were like, oh, we can't go up, to they're like big people and they're talking to people. And I'm like, believe me, they're at conventions to meet their readers and their fans and things like that. You can go up to them. Obviously, there's times you shouldn't,
Right.
but for the most part, they want you to approach them. And so I obviously became like a sort of go-between. Like I was willing to make the introductions for them. And I believe you saw enough of what I was doing. Also, I went to Shahid's table and I told him off because on his table he had a new book
She
coming
tells me
out.
off a lot.
And I didn't even work for him yet, but he had a corner table set up, which happens often because
in the dealer's room. Yeah.
And he had a new release, but it wasn't like at the pride and center at the corner. There was like no sign or whatever. And I said, this is like positioned wrong for selling it. And you're like, if you want, you can move it around. And apparently me doing that meant that you sort of asked, I think, Mike, do you know much about Lezli?
And Mike said, in fact, of all his writer children, she was the one I needed to keep an eye on the most.
Yeah.
And which has
in
really
a good way.
In a good way, yes. And she has really proven that to be true in many ways.
So he ended up hiring me to be his assistant, Shahid did. And what ended up happening then is I was at first doing copy editing and proofreading, but we of course soon realized I was going blinder, and really it was becoming more obvious that I had the developmental editing talent. And because that was always there from the start, Shahid recognized this, and we basically changed the parameters of my job. And so that's how I got started editing novels.
Mm-hmm.
And then when Mike was starting to get a bit more, I'll say, frailer.
Yes.
I started sort of being backup support in the magazine, not editing. He still did the editing, but I would sort of do all the background sort of things. And so then that led to when he passed, me taking over.
And obviously I was very impressed by what you did. And it has gotten to the point where we publish a lot of fairly well-known authors, like New York Times best-selling authors. And a number of them have requested that Lezli be their editor.
Wow.
Because sometimes we work with some freelancers and all as well. I think I
can't edit every book.
Because it's a certain art form, being able to edit but keeping the author's voice without superimposing yours. And what I really like about Lezli, being an author, it must be tricky, but she does that. And I think the authors really appreciate that.
I know the authors definitely appreciate an editor, period. And then what you have to offer and bring to the table, so we're going to have a lot of people listening to this episode here. So I guess the topic or the basic theme of this is an editor, the value of an editor. One of the datums that I have from earlier this year or late last year was in 2022, there are 4 million books published.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them don't have editors.
Oh, I know, especially in today's
self-publishing stage. So I really want to go over the importance of an editor, and the different editorial roles that exist.
Mm-hmm.
So can you kind of you got the overall editor, but you've got copy editor, all the way across there.
Yeah. So I'll talk about copy editing and proofreading first because it's a little easier to talk about. So copy editing is once the manuscript's been professionally edited by a developmental editor, which I will talk about last. Where copy editing stage is when the book is essentially done and the copy editor's role is to go through and basically pick up typos, also like inconsistencies, like the person had red hair at the start, now they've got brown hair and things like that. And so it's more of like in a way a structural edit or a second eye to just capture like errors. Then when the book is typeset, so it's in its final form, proofreading is doing the same thing again. So whatever the copy editor might have missed. So you do the typos and the sort of inconsistencies, or the sentence that reads wrong. Like, so the copy editors or proofreaders reading it a couple of times because it doesn't make sense. But what a proofreader also does is physical formatting checks. So there's things like when hyphen breaks, the hyphen breaks could be in the middle of a syllable of a word, or some words like in between something, or like tomorrow have two at the start, and if it's split with morrow on the next line, it could read as to something. And so it just stops people from reading the line the correct way. So it'll do structural things on the page, positioning of things as well.
Because what's important to realize is that the copy editing will happen before the book is typeset.
Yes.
So there's things like hyphenation and all will not be apparent how the book is going to be typeset.
Yeah.
The proofreading actually occurs in the final stage just before the book is sent to the printers for us.
And
there'll be the typeset pages in PDF format, and they know exactly what the book is going to look. So if the typesetters have put a hyphen in the wrong place trying to manage the text and all that, that's where the proofreader will pick it up.
And at each stage too, like especially by the proof stage, sometimes errors can be introduced, like a wrong line break between it, a scene and stuff, and so you've got to check the scene breaks. If the scene ends at the bottom of a page, you might not be aware that there's a scene break there, so you have to put a symbol in so that the readers know then by turning the page it's a new scene. Now we get to developmental editing, which actually happens first, but it's the bit that's a little bit more detailed. So when there's a developmental edit, one of the key things that I point out is you're editing what's on the page, but you're also editing what's not on the page and what should be on the page. And so often when I do a developmental edit, I'm obviously making comments all the way through. And sometimes the answers to what I'm saying, like, why is this, will happen a page or two down. But what's key, and I'll put a note at the end, what's key is I obviously thought it should have happened 2 pages before because it stopped me and took me out of the book. So you're not all developmental editors do this, but I do also a line edit. So I can edit the lines. I can structure, I can fix punctuation.
Also at that point? The line edit?
Yes. So not all editors do a line edit. Some just put lots of comments, and they do somewhat edit through. But I can do a line edit also because remember, I'm also a writer, and I started writing in collaboration with Mike Resnick, so I can blend voices. Sometimes especially if it's a newer writer, if I can see the fix in my head, I could write it. I will write it. And I will change that bit, and I'll actually put like a little highlight box on it and say, you are very welcome to change it into your own words, but this is the fix that it needs. This is the type of fix that it needs.
Right.
And especially when it's like a few lines, it's actually easier for me to just organically do that and then put a quick comment rather than explain what's sort of missing.
Right.
And so I can be a lot more fluid than some editors, but developmental editor in general will do what's on the page that you see. And as I go through, I add comments, and some of the comments will say, this is a consistent thing that I see you do. So now that I've pointed out for the 6th time, I'll just edit all the way through. And if you see this change, why it's been edited. Then there's other comments where I'll say, okay, now I'm at page 40. I can see where you were going with this, but you did not represent this well. So as you go back, you drop more breadcrumbs or something like that.
Right.
But I also make a note of those comments in a separate file. And so as I get to the end, and I find a lot of people do this, they will set up the perfect ending that's not on the page. So there's one elephant that's not missing, or it's not as emotive or what have you. And so then I can show them, and I have actually written or tweaked the ending, and I've pretty much got a good track record. I would say 95% of whatever I've added into a story is kept.
Wow.
The author will ask to keep it or keep it, especially in the endings too. Endings are a little bit of one of my
your fortes.
Yes. and character development is a big thing for me.
And you've had some major character changes, I know, in some books. And their authors have accepted them and thanked them for it.
Yeah. And so one of the things, though, is remember how I said by page 40, I realized what they were trying to do?
Yeah.
Now, obviously, through the start of the book, they're meant to now need to make changes. But it's cruel to just tell, how it happened organically. It's by page 40, I realized. But remember how I said those comments I copy out? So then I do basically an editing report that I send, and those things that I flagged, and there was one actually by the end of the last book that I just did. One thing that, beautiful chapter, by the way, but it wasn't set up properly. So I did not see it coming. And I don't mean in a good way, as in it wasn't set up to come that way. Like there wasn't enough set up. So those things I put in a separate file and say, these 5 things you need to know from the start, because if he's editing through all the book and then gets to that, he then has to go back through the start and add those bits in. So I will create a report that has that global changes that I found on page 40 and 70 and 300. And so he knows to do them from the start. And so it very much is a collaborative process. And I try to make clear in the comments, like, this is a change that has to be made, like, for us to accept this book. There are certain things that are definite edits that are needed, and certain things where this is the problem, this is my suggested fix. But if you find another way to fix it, as long as it's fixed, I'm happy. And so that's why it takes a bit more to describe a developmental process.
Right.
And it's different with every author and every book.
Yeah.
And so, and so that's basically developmental editing.
So now when you I got my book. So here I go. I've written my book.
Yep.
And I now need to get ready to publish it.
Yes.
How many of those editorial things do I need to do? What do on that thing there?
So are you talking about self-publishing or? Yeah. Okay. So if you're self-publishing, very rarely do you have all 3 stages, because a lot of people can't afford it.
Right.
And to be frank, freelance editors can be quite expensive, especially if you want to get the good ones. And so it depends on how much money are you willing to put into your book.
Right.
I obviously recommend all 3 stages, but I've come from a traditional path, but I definitely recommend, if you're not going to get a developmental editor, because a lot don't. I have to say, self-published, they don't really do developmental. Definitely get a proofreader, because copy editor, in a way, proofreader is basically a copy editor with the extra step of checking the formatting of the book as well. So I would recommend, if you're going to skip a stage, if you could do developmental and proofreading, that would be great. You could skip copy editing and save money there. But I would definitely, at the very least, get proofreading, because I often can know a self-published book from the errors you see on page 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah.
And also, just to interact, different set of eyes pick up different things.
Yes.
And if you've missed something, and we will, no matter how good an editor you are, if you're line editing or whatever, you will miss things. It's just impossible to get a perfect book out.
Right.
And if you've missed it the first time, even if you read it again, you're probably going to miss it again. It's just a propensity
I know, it's
we
crazy
have.
how that
It's
happens,
crazy that,
but it does.
And that's what we found, is that even small things, sometimes when there are multiple eyes looking on it, they pick up different things. With some one miss, the second one, when they'll pick it up. So the more set of eyes, the better. But it's not a cheap proposition.
I've also had an interesting thing where every now and then an author will be passionate about one thing. Like, no, I like this obscure word that takes readers out of the book, right? And I'll say, okay, that's a hill you could die on if you want. However, and how I do it is I say, if the copy editor and proofreader also flag it, remember they're experts, well, then you should change it.
Yeah.
Like, if it's just me, and obviously I'm pretty good at knowing what the copy editor and proofreader will flag. And I'm from another country. I've come to the US, right. So I've actually got a broader. So one of the authors we edited is a British author that also lives in the US. And so I had to be aware that I would know more words than the US audience, which is the primary audience. But there are even some that I flagged and I said, this is obscure for me. And, I'm Australian. And so there's an element of that too with what Shahid was saying with having other eyes. Another thing, by the way, that some authors do when they can't afford editing is, and a lot of even professional authors will do this now before they get to an edited stage, is beta readers.
Yeah.
And so they'll have like a pool of, now often they're friends or at the very least colleagues. And so there can be a personal bias or a less professional eye. But believe me, they do pick up things.
They'll minimally find typos and like,
yes,
where's the end of the sentence?
Yes, and that can be a free way of getting extra help as well. But also it creates a writing group is always a good thing to have a writing community.
Yeah, when I spoke with Michael Anderle, he's got the LMBP Publishing. He's one of the ones that started the 20 books to 50K.
Oh yeah.
And he comes up, he does a lot of, like, there's a book a week that he publishes. I think he says he's got 3 proofreaders for each book. He has it read 3 times, and he said that at that point it works pretty good. At that point it's clean. One set of eyes, 2 set. No, it's got to be. I think he said 3 sets of eyes has to do the proofread to make sure that they can get these things. Because whereas I will dub in the word if where it's missing, and someone will say it's missing if, but then they will miss the omitted period at the end. Whereas I get enough people reading it, just, and I'm always amazed myself when I do something. I read it over, okay, I got it, and then just before I publish it, like on social media, on Facebook, I've been doing. I was just this morning. I was like, what, and sometimes it's just like you need to take that extra care to go through it, because I have a problem when I read a book and it's full of typos, and full could be even just a few.
Yeah.
If I catch a typo, then why didn't they catch it? And didn't they care enough to make sure there were no typos?
It just took you out of the story.
Yeah, it took me out of the story.
Yep.
But unfortunately, it will take me out of the author too, because if that author only cares that much for his story, that he won't see to it to ensure that it really is clean, then.
And you may not, one doesn't even sometimes realize it, but if there are a lot of errors in the book, even if you're not recognizing each error, there's something in our brains that recognizes that there's something wrong with this book.
I have a perfect example of this as well. We have some dyslexic writers, and like, for the example, there's read as in read a book, and there's read as in like the read in the, like, the edge of the waterways. And so there's a lot of with dyslexic authors where it's the same sounding word but different spelling or whatever, and they're changed in it, and it especially with dyslexic authors, it happens without them. It's obviously not their choice, but it's a definite dyslexic trait. As a developmental editor, I catch most of them, but the ones that are subtle like that, I'm quite blind, as you know, and so that will escape me possibly, and so you need that other person and then the next person to pick up those, and especially like the double words or the missing word. If you've written it, you read it with the missing word in there.
That's right.
But the next person that's like, wait, this sentence doesn't make sense.
And sometimes it's just interesting. There's a book we got, which is actually being published in the UK by a different publisher, and we got the manuscript from them. And it's with a copy editor. And she came to me, the biscuit and cookies, the meanings are opposite. Should I reverse them? And I said, oh, yes, it makes no sense. And, like putting gravy on cookies will not make any sense to an American reader.
Right.
It's interesting, these little things that come up that the editor needs to pick up.
And the thing is, like I said, for myself, and I can't be the only one, I get turned off by that. And so that potential, audience that author has is now lost to them. And there's no scarcity of authors to read out there.
Yeah.
And unfortunately too, it's one of those, what's like a snap judgment. automatically, no matter how this person might have blood, sweat, and tears went into the actual writing of the book and all of this. But if the presentation looks less professional, then the judgment goes on the author.
Yeah.
And you can't escape it. There was a book I've seen recently that was done by some anthology authors, and they're new to the anthology field. They haven't sort of done it before. Very good book, great authors. You know, they got some great headliners in that. They've obviously never, I don't know if they didn't have anyone look over it, but it was done like manuscript style. There was no like justification. So to readers listening, you know, when you look at the page of a book in a novel or even a nonfiction book, it'll have the text goes right up. It's what they call justified. It goes right up in a straight line on the left and on the right.
Yeah.
But if you're writing like words or, you know, handwriting or whatever, the right side is always ragged, you know?
Yeah.
And so they didn't have it justified like a normal book. And it was double spaced still, like a manuscript, which also wastes page in the book. And straight away, it looks less professional. Like it doesn't look like it looks like, you know, kids in school could have put it together. And unfortunately, despite the names in the book and that, it just makes it seem like a less professional product.
That makes sense.
Because at that point, the reader probably will not even get a chance to find out how good the writing is, which may be the great writing, because it's just such an off turner when you look at the book and just see that it's so
and also
unprofessionally done.
The reason why I deliberately explained what justification means is the reader won't necessarily know that specific term, but they look at it and go, something's off with the formatting in this book. It just doesn't look right, you know.
That's right. So on now, how did you connect up? So I guess it was you found the one book that wasn't properly placed on his table, and that's how you connected up. How did you then connect up with Mike Resnick?
Mike, I needed an introduction to a book for you publishing. I was fortunate enough to get rights to Galoui's Dark Universe through Spectrum, and Eleanor Wood was the agent. So I asked Eleanor, I need someone to write an introduction to this new edition we're doing. And she suggested Mike, because Mike was a huge fan of Galoui's. So I got in touch with Mike through that. And you know how somehow or the other you just connect? We just started talking. And he, in a way, he was very business oriented also. If you know, he was a writer and also very good on he used to write a column for the SIPFA magazine on the business of publishing. So he kind of became, in a way, like a business mentor to me. And started kind of guiding me through some of the things, because my background was not in publishing. It was actually in money management before I had like my midlife crisis or whatever, and quit my job and did a crazy thing and set up a publishing company out of the blue. And my wife asked, what do you know about publishing? I said, I really like to read books. I always read books.
You like the end product.
But, you know, I was fortunate. And anyway, so that's how I met Mike. And then we used to do like seminars or like writing workshops and all on cruise ships. He was on that.
Sail to Success. What a great line.
Yes. He did a Stella Gill series for me. And like for the magazine where he became really involved, he actually basically almost volunteered to do the magazine for free as long as I would help him promote newer authors, because that was a big deal with him. As he once pointed out that when he was growing up, there were like 40-50 magazines that would pay them, young writers, for young short stories. And at that point when we were talking, there were like 3 or 4 magazines that would pay, and they're all competing with, you know, like Haldeman or himself, Resnick or whatever. And he said it's just very tough. So he said, you know, he'd pretty much do it as a favor. He'd create the whole magazine and kind of, as long as, you know, we paid well and we paid the writers well, and he had the opportunity to basically give it exposure to new writers.
And then he
we
would
started
buy-
working very closely with that.
Yeah. And then he would buy reprints of the big names.
Oh,
so
yeah.
we'd still have the big names in the magazine, like little draw cards, but he would give the money to the newer writers,
Yeah.
like for the new stories.
Yeah, we paid like piddling for the new, because what I've discovered in this field is that it's actually a fairly giving field. They don't, as long as, sometimes they don't mind. They want to help newer authors. So a lot of these big writers, and he knew everybody under the sun, and he got stories off everyone for like, $25 a story, $50 reprints, but still, just really, but we could headline the magazine with these names. But at the same time, then with the headliners would come newer authors who would get some exposure because of that. And then we ran that for a while, and I got to know him extremely well through that. And I got to find out what a great guy he was. And he is responsible for me meeting Lezli.
Yeah.
Because, through him, I met Lezli. And in fact, he introduced me to you two and said he's one of the guys you need to stay in touch with. He's one of the good guys in the business. So here we are.
And Mike was definitely
6 degrees of separation.
Yes, it's a fact. That's a fact. Now, when you do your talks at conventions, or even when you just did today at the Writers Workshop, what are like one or two of the most common questions that you're asked that will help make a difference on a person? He's written a good story that will help make him that much more certain that he's going to be successful, whether submitting to an editor. I know, was it you talking? No, it was Kevin Rebecca earlier talking about he had a book contest and sending in stories, and some is supposed to be horror but humorous, and somebody just said a story that started off horror, middle horror, ending horror, nothing humor at all. And he called and said, "Why did you do that?" I said, "That's all I had, so I just sent you what I had." He said, "I'll never buy from that author again, because I wasted an hour of reading something which wasn't what I called for." So what are some like tips or things that authors should heed with submitting to a magazine?
I can definitely cliff note basically today's writers, conference. So to answer, I do the answer first and then the question that's often most asked. So the answer is don't self-reject. And what I mean by that is, like, there's a whole submission fear, like, oh, the story's not ready yet. So the question is, how do you know a story is finished if you're a new writer? Like, how do you know if it's good enough? Because everyone's been told now you have to have a real polished work and that. I will say I prefer a diamond in the rough that I can polish than a perfectly structured story that puts me to sleep. So it has to be good enough. It doesn't have to be perfect. And so I actually was telling people today that when you get to the point, because it is a good thing to put the story aside for like a day or two and go back and do a little edit before, you finish off, because you can actually realize that you've missed something or add something. But I said, when you get to the point where you're like on that, the little gerbils on the wheel circling around, if you're second guessing your edits, that's when you stop, because you're just going to edit out the beauty, or you're not then you're being too self-critical.
Yeah.
So
Dean
when
Wesley
you
Smith
start,
talks about too, when you get to the point like you got this beautiful rock and you put it in a rock polisher, and it runs and runs and runs, and by the time it's done, it looks like every other rock that's been polished.
Exactly. And so I prefer an author to stop when the instinctive edit is done, where they're not overthinking it or thinking too much. And so the answer to that is also don't self-reject yourself. Don't second. You definitely have to look at the guidelines, what you were saying just before. And I actually stress this to them. I don't want the pretty fonts and the image cover things on the front and stuff like that, because straight away you think, how good can this story be if they can't even follow simple guidelines that are on the website?
Exactly.
And the other thing is, which I told them, and this did generate a few laughs, is don't write, because often the magazines will have a spot for a cover letter. I say, write the cover letter like your story can be bought, and it's a, don't write your cover letter to sell your story. The story should stand for itself. I don't want an intro to the story. I don't want why you think the story will be amazing. I want you to write the cover letter like the story, you're confident the story will sell. So you just say, this is my credentials. This one's a sci-fi story. Like if someone asks what the genre is or whatever, it's a sci-fi story. It's X amount of lengths, looking forward to your response, do the pertinent sort of things. But so I gave them examples of cover letters not to send that I have received. One of them, which is very easy to tell you now, was you're going to love this. Ellipsy. Just wait for it. Ellipsy. It's coming soon. Ellipsy. Now, we did get a kick out of the cover letter, but one of the things, guess what, that I tell my proofreader, not my proofreader, my first reader, I tell her to ignore all cover letters and read the story without looking, because I don't want any to be prejudiced with the story and the author. And then she can look afterwards and go, and half the time she goes, well, that tracks with the story, right? Because you don't realize how many tells you have when you're trying to communicate with someone.
Right.
And cover letters is a big tell,
For sure.
And so that would be one of the biggest advices, is to do with that. So don't over edit.
Right.
Don't oversell yourself in a cover letter. And I definitely said, look at the guidelines and make sure.
And I would like to reiterate that you'd be surprised at how many people don't just ignore the guidelines, and that's an easy reject.
Yeah.
If you're not following, the guidelines are out there, follow. They're usually very simple, and so many people just ignore them.
And
for whatever reason.
The rating of 1 out of 10 will have a note from my first reader that says, because it's 25,000 words. And our guidelines say up to 8,000, right? It does. It's all she did. She didn't even read the first paragraph to know that it's good enough. It could have been the most amazing novella in the world. She opened up the file, went straight down, because it's obviously a part of our guidelines, and looked at the word count and went, nope. And it's an instant reject. And you know what? They might have been waiting in our submissions. We had about a 3-month turnover. It got down to 2 months towards the end.
Mm-hmm.
But they, like, some magazines have like a year or
yeah.
And so if you're submitting to the wrong market, you're also not selling that story because you haven't paid attention to the guidelines. So
exactly.
Yeah.
So now on the distinction of hats between publisher and editor.
Mm-hmm.
So what's your role as publisher?
The way I have a slightly different background, like I mentioned earlier, than a lot of other publishers. Like my background was not in the business, and which is probably one of the reasons why I'm still alive after 15, 16 years, because I didn't know anything about publishing when I came in, which is a crazy model. But I like to, people have asked me that, and I like to think of myself more as like a project manager. I make sure everything runs smoothly.
He also does all the pain.
Yeah, and writing the checks, yes. Which is the painful about that.
And he's a publisher that actually does pay.
But so basically, I'll make sure things are being on schedule. They are being assigned to the right editors. Work is flowing.
How many editors do you have?
Mostly me, but we do have some freelance. So like Kat Rambo.
Yeah, Kat Rambo does. Well, that's on the developmental side. It's you and Kat Rambo on the development side. Deborah is a regular proofreader. Yeah, she's a very good proofreader. She works with some major, like Norton and a bunch of other people.
We had Alicia K.
Alicia K was a copy editor.
Yes.
And right now, Barbara is our main copy editor.
Yeah.
Having said that, sometimes depending on how busy things are, we'll hire some other freelancers that we work with over time. But these are the main people right now doing it. So typically, if you get a book, Lezli will do the developmental edit, then I'll go to Barbara for a copy edit, I'll go to typesetting, and then Deborah for a final proofread.
Yeah. But everyone else other than me is like part-time. You know?
Right.
Yeah. She's the only full-time employee, and she's more like an editor. She's really like a partner in the business in many ways.
I'll also like help proof the covers,
and things like that.
Yeah.
And but really, it's going to be my job that if Barbara's not available, make sure that somebody else steps in, and somebody can fill in, or if Leslie's not available, you'll go to Cat Rambo or some other person, because to make sure that things are flowing. And then obviously my job is also going and meeting people, getting the contracts, and
Right.
and things like that.
We talked
Have the fancy lunches and
Yeah, exactly.
and like-
That's right up my alley. Have those fancy lunches.
Okay, so we've talked about there's a personality thing too. So Shahid is very much like the entrepreneur. You're like the ideas person.
Yes.
And there are times, and I'm the detail person, which of course tracks with my job. I've got to edit
Right.
on the page.
Right.
I've got to edit between the lines, what's not on the lines. And so I'm a perfectionist, detail, extreme person. And it has caused us to butt heads, not in a bad way at times, because sometimes it's like, I need this done. And I'm like, no, I'm still in the weeds in this book. And part of it is you don't obviously have an idea of certain elements because you're not the editor. And so we've actually sort of started to work out like, and he will ask, okay, so what would you think, how long would this book take? I'll go like, hypothetically, it should be this. But what if there's a problem right at the end? Like the book that I was saying that had something right at the end that was beautiful but wasn't set up. Then I have to write the bigger note and do more edits. And so the biggest difference I would say between his job and mine is still a creative job.
Yes.
And his is very much a business.
mechanical.
That's why I said like a
Yes.
project manager. I'm managing the
Yes.
business side.
Yes.
So I'm looking at the schedules. I'm looking at the publication
Yes.
date. I'm
You're looking at your checkbook too.
my checkbook and all that, saying let's get this done. And
Yes.
but this doesn't sound right. I'm saying I'm being the mean publisher. It doesn't matter. We'll just get it out. And,
Yeah.
and then she'll.
And I can't do that. No.
But what's really good with the two of us is because we do have different strengths, and we realize that. So it kind of works really well.
Yes.
Because not one person doesn't have the answers to everything.
Right.
There's a part of the creative process, and then we'll talk about it. And like I said, maybe even butt heads, but come to a compromise that's like reasonable. That because in the end, we are also running a business.
Another big thing about that I've noticed too is because we have the very different perspectives. At times, I don't obviously see it from his point of view, and he doesn't see it from mine. Like there is often like, especially like with covers and things like that, the final product look or like promotion and things like that, we'll throw ideas at each other from our different perspectives, and then we come up with a better idea together because our two perspectives then makes us bounce off each other. And then we sort of go, oh wait, what about this? And then you'll go, or we could do this.
Yeah.
And we've done that a lot. Like we have almost a synchronicity about how we can sort of level each other up.
Yeah.
And it's the sort of thing that, yes, maybe I could have come up with that final thing eventually, but you're not bouncing off someone, so it's, you know, and
I think I've been very fortunate ever since. And one of the reasons probably for my success has been I've always had good people who worked for me.
Right.
Before you, that was Laura, who was actually Mike
Laura
Resnick
sound
once
like
said
really
that
good.
she.
I wish I had met Laura. Yeah.
She had to leave because of family health issues or whatever. That she was the first one, and then Lezli came on board. And I've just, like I said, been fortunate that I've picked those people up. And one of the things that they've always been very honest about giving their opinion, maybe a bit too honest sometimes, but it's really in the end makes for a great product.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So on Galaxy's Edge, so it's no longer Galaxy's Edge magazine. It's just Galaxy's Edge
Anthology series.
Yes. And it's an annual.
Yes.
So what does a person have to do? Because it's before with the magazine that was at the portal they uploaded for when you had your curtain calls there.
It's going to be very similar, except it's less work for me, essentially. So if you look at the magazine, we were bi-monthly. So essentially that if you don't think of the magazine format, it's very similar to an anthology. Magazines and anthologies often have multiple pieces from multiple authors, and the length is comparable. But I would have to do it every 2 months, put out a new issue. And believe me, there's enough people that you'll send out edits and then 2 people won't respond. So then you have to edit a few more stories. And then it's like a puzzle piece. So you have to have the certain amount of pieces. With a magazine, you also had nonfiction pieces. I would have to, like nudge people for deadlines and things like that. And so the difference with the anthology, one of the biggest differences is we can get into bookstores. Like even Analog and Asimov used to be in like news agencies and like Barnes and Nobles and that. And half the time now they're not in the stores.
Right.
And so the anthology format, as you know, Writers of the Future, beautiful anthology every year. The format is more easily accessible, I think, in nowadays, and more sellable. And so essentially what I'm going to do is the same thing with the portal. We'll have the Moksha portal each year, and we're going to be very consistent. It'll open for a month this time of year, but a few months ahead we'll release the what the anthology theme is. So they have a few months to write it, and then they can submit it throughout September. And then in the following year, it'll be published. And the Writers of the Future, actually, the winners this year got a head start. They know what the theme is. So they've got a head start, and I'm going to have a special portal for them so that they can submit a month early.
Yep.
And so then I can go through the stories. And if there's one that's, even if it's not fully polished, because they're new writers, I have the time to edit a story to buy with an author. So kind of doing a bit of Mike's thing, a bit of pay it forward. And it gives me a little time to work with newer authors.
Yeah.
To, so they can get another first sale,
Which is awesome.
Yeah. So, and that will be set dates each year, so we don't have to pull our hair out and, and believe me, 1 a year is much easier than 6 a year.
And it really was extremely time consuming and all that. And also our distribution system, the way we are set up, we represent by consortium as a distributor.
You're getting the business side again.
The business side.
Yeah.
They primarily do books. And I actually talk to them. They don't really do magazines. So the magazines, we'd have to rely pretty much on online sales. And magazines are a hard sell. With the book format, we can take the same product and put it in Barnes and Noble into the brick and mortar stores much more easily because we are set up to do that. So it's less time consuming, and we are a very small press, and we do a lot of books, and publishing this every 2 months was just a real hard job. And and on the other hand, the biggest advantage is that it will now be available to all the bookstores on traditional book terms. So it'll be available, there's no guarantee Barnes and Noble will carry it, but it'll be available on traditional terms as a book to them.
And you can order it.
Ingram?
Yeah.
That's because you work with Ingram and
with consortium, which is a part of Ingram now, and it is a full distribution company. Like they only represent publishers at a full discount, full returnability. The whole traditional thing about books. So they actually have a sales for. In fact, I'm going to be in New York early May doing a presentation to consortium sales force about our fall and winter lineup, so they can actually go to all the bookstores and say, "Hey, you got to buy our clients' books." And things like that. So it's a very different model.
Yeah, okay, good.
Yeah.
Now, with the future of magazines is definitely, part of what you've done, you've now switched gears and you're making an anthology. I'm experiencing a bit of a resurgence in short fiction. And what's your take on short fiction and the importance of it to, we'll keep it science fiction and fantasy, but for a writer of science fiction and fantasy, what's the value to a writer on science fiction and fantasy writing versus that to a consumer?
So I have a couple of answers to this. One, it helps you hone your skills. Writing in short form is actually considered very hard by some very successful novelists. They're like, we cannot do short. So the short form does help you hone on different lengths.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the big things it does, especially if you're writing novels, if you're wanting to traditionally publish, you will know that sending a novel out, it takes years to even get a response.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it gets accepted, it goes through different stages. Short fiction can get your name out there and start recognition happening and start a career and even get a following, because shorter fiction can get noticed for the awards and things like that, and you get a reputation. So it's almost like you're if you want to be ultimately a novelist and not always short fiction, you're almost starting like telling people, look, this is a taste of what I can do. Now I'm of the opinion that short fiction is just as good as novels. I want to always do both. So, but there's gaps in between novels and things like that. And sometimes you need a break from the novel. So you write something else to sort of take you away. And it's just in today's world is very instant gratification world. So if you also have short pieces out there, you can give people like a little snippet of your work.
Nugget.
Yes, a little nugget. And especially if you can tie it into your series, because interconnected books, the term interconnected is big right now. If you can like connect things. And it's also brand building, And so in science fiction and fantasy, it's very, very established that a lot of authors started out writing the smaller, shorter pieces and then sold the novel. Now, you don't have to always do it that way, but I do think it is a very proven way to start a career. And also going to science fiction and fantasy conventions. As a short story author, you then meet the editors of, like, say, Tor or whatever, and they've recognized your name because they also read the magazines, because in their break, they're reading some short fiction and stuff. So then they're like, you know what? I have a novel on my desk that's, and I love that short story they did. So it just gives you an extra chance.
Yeah.
It's a foot in the door and raising your profile.
And also, I mean, it's one way where you can really piggyback on the reputation of someone else to get your story
because
before
you can be in anthologies and magazines.
Yeah, which was what Mike Resnick was doing Galaxy's Edge. He'd get all these great authors headlining the magazine and then slip in half the magazine with newer writers.
So it puts
because
a spotlight.
People might be buying awesome Scott Card story, but on the other hand, they're also then going, but they have the story right there. So they're probably going to read the same and say, oh, this is a great writer as well.
What else have they written?
Yeah, exactly. Something like that. And also, I'm telling it does make a difference. If you go to like an editor and say, oh, I've been published, for example, in Clark's World, which is a great magazine right now run by Keneal Clark, I think it would make a difference to the editor. Oh, he got accepted by Clark's World, he must have written something well, or Galaxy's Edge, or whatever. It does make a difference, and that way.
Good.
Confidence building too.
All right. Now, you were talking a bit earlier about not the topic of, but sometimes people will put on the pitch letter, it goes with a story. What are some of the top turnoffs on a pitch letter?
The biggest one, you mean a cover letter?
Yeah.
Is if they summarize their story. Believe me, people will do that. This is a dark horror story about, this is a dark fantasy horror about a boy that doesn't know how to fight dragons. So he goes into the cave and has to learn how to wield a weapon for the first time and conquer his fears. I'm like, okay, so like watching a movie trailer. Those movie trailers you get now that you see the whole damn movie in the 2 minute, sorry, excuse my French, in the 2 minute trailer. Why do I have to read the story now? And believe me, it's the thing that I was saying is the story should speak for itself. Don't try to sell the story to me. And so you actually, in a cover letter, you don't want to pitch.
Right.
Now, if it's like where you're sending an outline or something to like an agent or something, well, then that's in the nature you're meant to have a pitch in there. You're meant to have like the elevator pitch ready. You're meant to have the longer pitch ready, and there's different stages. But when you're submitting to a magazine or anthology, your work should stand for itself. And so another don't have typos and everything in a poorly written cover letter, because it doesn't give confidence for the work within.
Okay. Okay, good. And on these letters that they send with their cover letter that comes in, with their story, is there certain? And I know all this stuff is in your on your guidelines.
Yeah.
Says don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. Do people sometimes still do the? They want to do the script font that looks real cute, and then try different colored inks. And
now that we're with Moksha, the cover letter they can't really do much because it's like in one field in the Moksha thing. But when I get the manuscripts, I've actually had manuscripts that have had cover images, like actual images on the cover. And as soon as you see that, you go, oh gosh, you dread turning the page, so to speak. And so then you scroll down, and yes, there is font colors. There is, you name it, I've seen it. There is some that sends clip art stuff in it. And I'm seeing John's face. He's like, really? And it screams amateur. Do you know what screams professional? Is when it is in the exact format you put on your submissions guideline. Because even like my first reader, I had to train her in two things. And so this is something that's interesting to know for all authors. Magazines and anthologies and that, the editors do tend to have, like, I can publish any story, but there are certain things that if you know, there's more likely I'll buy a certain story. So I have to train my first reader to actually send me stories I would like to buy. So I trained her that way. But she's also been trained in structure and all of this and the guidelines as well. So the amount of rejections that I had where she's like reject is just in the guidelines alone, because she straight away says, I don't even like, I gave it a little bit of a chance, but they already skipped guidelines 2 and 3. And so I was already prejudiced against the story, It really is vital.
And it is the thing too, if someone can't be bothered to read the guidelines and submit, you don't know anybody anything anyway, but that's kind of like, that's just not fair. They're not, if they're not willing to play by the rules, then
as I said,
they're not in their game.
Exactly. And it actually prejudices you against the story, because you're like, if that person couldn't be bothered to look at our guidelines or adhere to the guidelines, what's the quality of story they're sending in, And so there is such a thing as, my first reader is very similar to me. I like getting new authors. Like, I even told her there are going to be stories that you get that from people from other countries that won't be perfectly written necessarily, and there'll be dyslexic authors. So I actually told her, in your judging, be a little bit less judgy on structural until you know if there's a story. Because if the story is amazing, and I told her sort of what level of structural thing to look for. If the story is amazing, I can work on the structure. You can't teach talent,
right?
And so we won't necessarily judge if the structure is not, if it needs work, if the story's there, but we will judge if you couldn't be bothered to listen to the guidelines, It might be the perfectly written story, but we're already prejudiced against.
And
it's instinctive. It's not like we're mean people, but you just it's a professional thing.
But also keep in mind, it's a very competitive field. I mean, you get hundreds of submissions, and that's just one more black mark against you. And it's a big black mark if you can't even be bothered reading the simple instructions.
Totally hear you.
The instructions are not complicated. It'll basically say, use this font, don't do this, or whatever. Just read the instructions. I mean, we don't make it complicated. We keep it simple. And if you're not going to be bothered doing that, then out of the, 500 stories we've gotten for like 10 stories you're going to buy, that's an easy one to say, no, thank you to.
Yeah. Good.
No.
Okay, now we've surprisingly not finished our hour. That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
I almost asked a question and we still... So I'm going to stretch this just a little bit more. Like one thing I was going to talk about was on Writers of the Future. From your perspective, what's the value of Writers of the Future to the genre of science fiction and fantasy? We're in the 40th anniversary, so I want to be able to do something to get your perspective as an editor and publisher.
It's come incredibly valuable. I have to say I did get a laugh because I did pre-warn your writers. I said, the rest of your career might, is not going to have red carpets and banquet, awards necessarily guaranteed. But you can have amazing careers. How many of the writers have gone to have amazing careers? Like, I mean, very famous authors have come out of Writers of the Future. And what I think is very important about Writers of the Future is it opens the world to these authors. So, I mean, the science fiction and fantasy world. So it gives them an introduction to the field. It values them. And like, I mean, obviously there's the value of you literally flying them in, treating them, but you don't just bring them for the award. You will do a workshop for a whole week where they can learn. And I think if anything, the workshop is even more valuable than getting the award. Yeah. And so they get insights. Like I saw when I was talking, they were writing notes and things like that. And so I think it's very valuable in not just starting careers, because obviously it starts a career, but showing the promise of what their talent can bring. Because there's going to be, as I said to them, they're going to get rejections. Then, it's not going to be all smooth sailing. Not everyone gets the $1 million deal. But I have personal friends from Writers of the Future that have won awards and then made like 3 book deals or so forth. And so I think what Writers of the Future, the biggest thing it does is it shows the promise of this field and gives them a taste of what their talent can bring. And I think that's so valuable to a new writer when you always have so much self-doubt,
Good.
Yeah. And you had mentioned something like 4 million books being published. I think venues that give recognition to truly good writers are invaluable right now, because as this is expanding in such crazy ways, and there really is, and I mentioned like one of Mike Resnick's big concerns was the lack of opportunities for newer writers. And that's what I think something like Writers of the Futures is really invaluable. It's another opportunity for talented writers and illustrators to really showcase their work and shine. And I think it's just going to keep getting more and more important as the years go by and the 4 million becomes 8 million.
Elmer Hubbard had it totally spot on when he had that vision, and it just continues to grow and expand. So many of our judges just totally align themselves to that vision, and it just continues to grow.
True.
Yeah. 40 years.
I know.
Ever so slightly impressive. It's amazing.
Absolutely. So, and thank you for listening. Subscribe to the Writers of the Future podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We have also been syndicated on the United Public Radio Network, where you can find these podcasts as well. As I said before, Writers of the Future can be purchased wherever books are sold in the U.S., Canada, the UK, Australia, and South Africa, and available everywhere via Amazon.com. We're especially appreciative of our sponsor, Carnation, for supporting this podcast. Carnation was introduced in 1899, and 2024 marks its 125th birthday. So Carnation has been making delicious milk products for 1.25 centuries and is still going strong. Writers and Illustrators of the Future are contests created by L. Ron Hubbard to provide a means for the aspiring writer and artist to be seen and acknowledged for 4 decades. It is free to enter and open to amateur short story writers and artists of science fiction or fantasy.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
All right, everybody, it's time for you to get out and nominate your favorite podcasts. There's a show I want you to consider for the People's Choice Podcast Awards. Writers and Illustrators of the Future podcast in 3 categories: education, storyteller and drama, and arts. For 5 years and with over 280 weekly episodes and 64 million plus downloads, the Writers and Illustrators of the Future podcast has provided advice and tips from international best-selling authors, world-class artists, contest judges and winners, and industry professionals. It is based on the world-famous Writers of the Future contest created in 1983 by L. Ron Hubbard to help the aspiring writer and artist no matter their age, race, ethnicity, or gender. It is dedicated to the future of storytelling and art by showing that it is never too late to start, and those who make it are those who never give up. We are all busy, but I'd be so grateful if you could take a moment and vote now. Go to podcastawards.com to nominate the Writers and Illustrators of the Future podcast in any or all 3 of the categories: education, storyteller, drama, or art. News on the flip side. It's time for you to get out and nominate your favorite podcast. There's an amazing show I want you to consider for the People's Choice Podcast Awards. The News on the Flip Side, in the category of politics and news. News on the Flip Side is a much different news and political program, which is not deemed as opinion news. Listen as anchor host Joe Montaldo brings you just the facts from trusted sources, which will allow you, the people, to make up your own minds on the various stories being reported on. Go to podcastawards.com to nominate the News on the Flip Side in the category of news and politics. That's podcastawards.com. Please take a moment and vote now.
So Emily is polite. I mean, get the bleep out there and vote. So if you were on News on the Flip Side last night, you would have actually heard the bleep word. Because you're an author's quill, you won't actually hear that word. But go listen to News on the Flip Side and you'll hear it. So anyway, people, get out and vote. I expressed this. I don't want to be a runner-up. I want to win. So somebody writes in last night, said, well, Joe, y'all get like second and third every year. What are you bitching about? I'm like, that's exactly what I'm bitching about. I'm like, come on, people. So, we do well. So I know a lot of y'all don't realize this, but the People's Choice Podcast Awards, about 5 million people vote. So anytime you see any of our shows make it that far, I mean, it's great. I mean, it's a lot of people voting. There's a lot of shows on there. And every year there's more shows that get in there that want to get their shows looked at. So, and it does come down to the vote. So they vote 5 million the first time. What is it? 5,000 the second time?
Yeah.
So they select people, shows that didn't make it, the hosts of those shows and other people that come in and vote. So you got to vote. Plus, and you also got to apply to be one of those other voters. Yes. I know where all of y'all live. Remember that. I have Hack Tracer, and it goes out and tells me where all of y'all live. Just remember that. When the Russians come, I'm sending to your house first. When Trudeau invades. Yes, I would pay money to watch Trudeau invade something. He can't invade, but I would pay money. But anyway, we got a guest coming to us with the second hour. The first guest today is on hiatus, so we'll see her in I think it's 3 weeks. Yeah. So
because she wants to be there when I'm there. She's a total Marie Whitaker, an absolute sweetheart. She runs the Superstars Writing Seminars, and I did a podcast interview with her, not this year but last year, as well as our next upcoming guest, Todd Fonestock.
and epic fantasy series, and just super, super nice people. Just, I'm really excited about it. And then Todd sent me his, he just published a book, which he sent to me on Thursday. And so I listened to it, just finished it just a few minutes ago. And it's basically his curve as an author, what he went through to actually make it as an author. And fantastic story. And just, you really get, you need to really have a drive to make it, but he attends a lot of conventions. We'll see him. You're coming to Dragon Con, right?
Yeah, I'll be there.
Yeah, we'll see him at Dragon Con, I think. And then I'll probably see him next week at San Diego Comic Con. But I was just in Clearwater this last week with Orson Scott Card. We deliver a writing workshop to 130 people. It was just so much fun. We took the online writing course that we have that's free for people to take, the one that you've gone through it a couple times. And instead of playing his videos, we had him live to talk about what his videos did, but we still had all the Dave Wolverton and Tim Powers videos.
Yeah, that is.
And then all the Owen Hubbard articles that they would read. But it was, I ran as a boot camp. I said, okay, we have a schedule. This is a crazy tight, target to get through this course over the weekend, but we're going to do it. We're going to be running you guys hard. So, it's okay, good. We got to get started right now. Okay, next. I was like drill sergeant.
That's how you got to do it, though. If you want, when you have limited time, you have limited time. Jackie, he is talking about the Writers of the Future course. So if you go over to writersfuture.com, there's a writers course you can take. It's a damn good course, actually. It's helped me in a lot of ways. No, I am not a writer, but we're not going to get into that. It's a really good course. No. All right, we'll talk about it in a few minutes. But anyway, it's a really good course. You should go take it. A lot of good information. It helped me in places. In all fairness, I probably will finally get a book out, but only because I met these people. The course taught me a lot.